All right, golfers, I want you to think about something here for those of you who have a really, really strong grip. I don't necessarily mind. There are a lot of different grip patterns that can work in this game. I will never be somebody who's going to change a grip just for the aesthetics of it, of saying, hey, it's too strong, it needs to be neutral. The golf swing doesn't work that simple. So if you have a very, very strong grip, I just want you to understand how you need to match that up. So for those of you who don't know, a strong grip, I'm not talking about the grip pressure. I'm talking about the rotational positioning of each hand. The glove hand, typically on a strong grip, will be very on top of the handle, and the non-glove hand will be very much to the side of it. Okay, so something like this, almost even underneath. When you have a strong grip, okay, when the club face is square in the setup position, a strong grip naturally presets itself with a lot of extension on the lead wrist. So you can see here my wrist angles are very cupped on this glove hand. Okay, so cupped meaning the knuckles of the hand are hinging above the forearm. What that essentially means is the strong grips, cupped wrist keeps the face square. So if I flatten this wrist out at all in the downswing, the club face angle can get very, very closed. Okay, so this is very important to understand. Now, if you have that strong grip, I don't necessarily mind. If the shaft is working the way you want it and the wrist angles are staying cupped and the club face is staying square, I don't necessarily mind if you do this because at the end of the day, this could be a very functional pattern to have. But you need to remember that you have to match up the strong grip with the cupped wrist. Now, if you have that same strong grip and you start to flatten out that wrist angle a lot, what ends up happening is you're going to get the club face very, very shut coming down, right? The club face was already square when the wrist was cupped. So if your wrist starts to get into a flat or even flexed position, flexed meaning bowed, right? So something like this here, what ends up happening is the club face is going to get very, very shut, right? So this golfer with a strong grip can't necessarily match up his strong grip pattern with any level of a flat or flex wrist because the club face is going to get way too close coming down. Now, this golfer cannot turn because they're going to hook the ball off the planet. So what ends up happening oftentimes if they do get into this environment, which I see often with good players, they'll typically hang back and deliver a high handle because delivering a high handle, what it does is it keeps the face open. You can see this, the more I raise the handle up, the more I'm actually going to open the club face, right? So they're trying to offset the fact that the face is shut by delivering a high handle to match it as a pattern, but now you're compensating your pivot in the downswing. A lot of strike tendencies are going to start coming up, issues, ball flight issues, you're going to hit blocks and hooks and all sorts of things. So in that scenario there, that strong grip golfer needs to retain lead wrist extension. So the lead wrist is the glove hand. So the thing that you need to keep in mind is you have to have that cupped wrist, but that also means that you need to find other ways to start shallowing the club better if you want to create that rotation that we talk about a lot. So if you're somebody who has that really strong grip, okay, and you obviously can't get the wrist moving to flexion because the face gets too close. Well, if you're keeping the cupped wrist, but you're having trouble in the downswing shallow the club because that lead wrist extension oftentimes wants to keep the club head very elevated, well, then you have a few options, right? You either need to find a separate way to shallow the club, or what you can do is you can then change your grip pattern, meaning you can take that strong grip and you can turn it into something a little more neutral or a little weaker than it was, right? And now all of a sudden, this golfer will actually have the ability to keep the wrist flatter in the downswing to be able to help them to shallow the club, and they are going to functionally have the ability to do so now without the club face getting so closed. So now you can see my wrist is quite flat, even a little bit flexed. The club face is not shut. The only reason that's the case is because my grip is weaker than that strong pattern I showed you earlier. So if you have a strong grip, I don't necessarily mind if you want to be able to do all the things you're doing well, shallowing the club, turning, and all of that. Well, if you can do that with the strong grip while retaining that extended wrist, that's fine because the club face stays square. At the end of the day, this is the main player of the game, right? Well, if you are getting into that strong grip and you're struggling to shallow the club because the cupped wrist is keeping the shaft angle very steep, which happens a lot, then from there, start to consider the opportunity or the possibility, let's say, of actually weakening your grip into something a little more neutral or even a little weak. I don't necessarily mind. As long as you match it up with the appropriate wrist angles, at the end of the day, you just need to get those two pieces working together. So you can get the weaker grip to now get some flexion on the wrist. The flexion on the wrist oftentimes can help you to shallow the club. And at the same time, the club face won't be so shut coming down, which will allow you to turn and release it appropriately, and you'll still hit your target. Whereas when the club face gets way too close coming down because the strong grip can't get the wrist flexed, if it does, face gets shut, golfer starts to compensate, high handle delivery, all sorts of problems, they end up struggling. So just keep this in mind.